Step quietly with us into the hidden corridors of power, where faith, education, and strategy intertwine. For centuries, the Jesuits have shaped leaders, influenced governments, and guided the course of history. Not with armies, but with intellect, subtle diplomacy, and the power of ideas. From the classrooms where revolutionaries and presidents alike were molded, to the shadowed chambers of the Vatican, their influence stretches far beyond what history books reveal. If this journey through silent authority, hidden networks, and the unseen architects of our world captivates you, stay with us. Like this video to honor the invisible forces that have shaped nations, share it to bring others into the mysteries often left untold, and subscribe to Mysteries of Earth to continue exploring the secrets, strategies, and untold stories that quietly write the story of humanity. Every view is a step deeper into history's hidden truths. In the quiet corners of history, where the eyes of the world seldom wander, influence moves like a whisper through the corridors of power. Wars are no longer waged solely on battlefields, nor are kingdoms won by swords alone. The true engines of change are subtler, invisible, yet infinitely more potent. Ideas, education, faith, and networks cultivated in silence. And among the most enigmatic architects of this hidden world are the Jesuits. Founded in 1540 by Ignatius of Loyola, the Society of Jesus emerged with a mission that seemed outwardly simple: to serve God through faith, education, and missionary work. But beneath this devout exterior lay a philosophy that would quietly shape the course of human history. The Jesuits understood that true power is rarely obvious. It does not demand attention, nor does it sit beneath gilded crowns. Instead, it works patiently, planting seeds that will flourish decades, sometimes centuries later across continents. From the bustling markets of Lisbon to the dense jungles of South America, Jesuits established schools, missions, and centers of learning. In these places, minds were not merely taught to read scripture, but to reason, to analyze, and to think strategically about the world around them. Students who would one day rise to positions of influence, politicians, scientists, generals, even revolutionaries, were guided by principles of discipline, logic, and observation. Every lesson, every discussion, every carefully chosen word carried the potential to ripple outward, altering the course of events far beyond the classroom walls. Yet the order's influence was not limited to education alone. The Jesuits operated in the shadowy spaces between diplomacy and ideology, in regions where empires rose and fell. Revolutions erupted, and entire societies were restructured. They became advisors, confidants, and spiritual counselors to kings and presidents, generals and diplomats. Their power was quiet, almost imperceptible, but its impact was profound. History often records the names of those who rule openly, but rarely those who taught them, guided them, or shaped the ideas they carried into power. This silent influence is perhaps most visible when we consider the Vatican itself. While popes stand before crowds in white robes, delivering proclamations to millions, the most consequential decisions often trace back to unseen hands. Within the halls of the Vatican, Jesuits have long played roles as educators, mediators, and advisors. They are the architects behind curricula, the unseen strategists shaping policy, the quiet interpreters of faith into action. One could argue that the white throne of the Pope has long been illuminated, not just by God, but by centuries of Jesuit design, shaping the order, the doctrine, and the decisions that influence millions worldwide. The true power of the Jesuits lies in patience, in the ability to endure, adapt, and persist without overt display. Unlike armies that march or governments that legislate, they operate through thought, philosophy, and influence. A word whispered in a classroom in Lima can one day reverberate in a presidential palace in Buenos Aires. A concept planted in a European university may shape the rhetoric of a revolutionary in Havana. Their reach is vast, spanning generations, continents, and disciplines, yet their presence remains largely invisible to the untrained eye. As we embark on this exploration, we must remember, history is rarely as it appears on the surface. While textbooks record wars, treaties, and conspicuous acts of leadership, they rarely capture the architects who laid the foundation for those moments. The Jesuits are not merely participants in history, they are its quiet engineers, moving with a discipline and subtlety that challenges our very understanding of power. In a world captivated by the visible, they remind us that the greatest battles are often fought in silence, and the most enduring legacies are built behind the scenes. The shadows of power are long, and the architects remain unset. Yet if we pay close attention, we may begin to trace the faint outlines of their design. And it is in these shadows, in these quiet corners of human history, that the story of the Jesuits begins. The 20th century arrived as an era of unprecedented upheaval. Empires that had stood for centuries crumbled into dust, nations were carved and recarved by war, and the ideological struggle between capitalism and communism cast a shadow over nearly every corner of the globe. In the chaos, power was not only wielded through armies or treaties, but through ideas, influence and foresight. And there, silently observing, carefully planning, were the Jesuits. Their order, founded in 1540 by Ignatius of Loyola, had spent centuries mastering the art of subtle influence. From the beginning, the Jesuits understood that true power is not always immediate or visible. It is cultivated patiently through education, discipline, and the shaping of minds. By the 20th century, that patience had borne fruit. The Jesuits were no longer merely missionaries or preachers. They had become architects of thought, guiding the contours of society from behind the scenes. Across Europe, the Americas, and Asia, Jesuit schools molded young leaders with a rigorous curriculum that combined theology, philosophy, rhetoric, and logic. Students were trained not just to memorize facts, but to understand systems, to discern patterns, and to see the hidden connections that others missed. In classrooms bathed in sunlight, lessons about morality and faith intertwined seamlessly with strategy and critical thinking. By the time these students stepped into positions of power, they carried with them a subtle Jesuit imprint, a disciplined mind capable of understanding, influencing, and reshaping society. But education was only one piece of a much larger strategy. The Jesuits had learned to observe silently, to position themselves like unseen pieces on a chessboard. In South America, Europe, and Asia, they became advisors to political leaders, confidants to generals, and mediators in crises. They were present during captures, evolutions, coups, and wars, yet rarely did their presence announce itself. Like master chess players, they anticipated moves, calculated risks, and guided outcomes in ways that seemed natural to the outside observer. Consider the political landscapes of Latin America during the Cold War. As the United States and the Soviet Union vied for influence, countries like Chile, Argentina, Brazil, and Nicaragua became battlegrounds not only for ideology, but for the hearts and minds of future leaders. Jesuits were quietly at work, sometimes teaching children who would grow into presidents, sometimes advising the intellectuals shaping policy, and at times engaging with grassroots movements that sought social justice. Their aim was not to impose power directly, but to ensure that their philosophy, their approach to discernment, and their understanding of influence penetrated every level of society. The Jesuits' strategy relied on patience, discretion, and adaptability. In times of turmoil, when dictators rose and democracies faltered, they often remained, sometimes guiding the oppressed, sometimes shaping the minds of those in authority. To the world, these interventions were invisible, almost incidental. Yet over decades, the cumulative effect was profound. The order had positioned itself at the crossroads of politics, education, and culture. The chessboard of the 20th century was vast and complex, filled with players whose ambitions and loyalties shifted like the winds. But the Jesuits understood the board differently. They did not seek immediate victory. They played for influence that would span generations. Each school founded, each student educated, each advisor quietly placed in a corridor of power was a move in a game whose scope exceeded the human lifespan. As the century progressed, wars ended, new nations emerged, and global alliances shifted. And yet through it all, the Jesuits remained. Silent, patient, invisible to most, but always present, an enduring force shaping history not through armies or empires, but through minds, ideas, and faith. In this age of upheaval, their strategy was clear. Place the pieces wisely, let the world unfold, and watch as influence quietly transformed the course of history. In understanding the 20th century, one must look beyond borders and battles, beyond treaties and treaties signed. One must notice the subtle movements behind the scenes, the whispered guidance, the careful cultivation of thought. Because on this chessboard, the most powerful players were often the ones no one saw, the architects of influence, quietly shaping the world, move by deliberate move. The Society of Jesus, founded in 1540, is often described in whispers, half feared, half revered, as a group of men whose influence stretches far beyond the walls of their monasteries. For centuries, the Jesuits have perfected the art of subtle power. Education, diplomacy, and strategy combined into a force both quiet and profound. Their presence is seldom acknowledged in public discourse, yet their fingerprints are found in corridors of power, academic institutions, and even the intricate workings of the Vatican itself. At the center of this vast web of influence stands the Superior General, an enigmatic figure often referred to as the Black Pope. Unlike the visible pontiff, whose speeches and ceremonies draw global attention, the Black Pope works in shadow. He does not command armies, yet his decisions ripple across nations. He does not campaign in elections, yet leaders often move in ways consistent with the philosophies he has long nurtured. His authority is not written into constitutions or statutes, yet it is absolute within the Society of Jesus. The strength of the Jesuits lies not in force, but in intellect and subtlety. From the classrooms of Jesuit universities to the halls of power in government and the Vatican, they cultivate minds capable of understanding the complexities of society and steering them toward carefully guided outcomes. Here, education becomes strategy, and ideas become instruments of influence. A student nurtured in Jesuit thought is trained not only to excel academically, but to observe, analyze, and act with discernment. Over decades, these students emerge as politicians, diplomats, scientists, and thinkers who carry, often unknowingly, the philosophical imprint of the order. In the Vatican, this quiet influence manifests in nuanced ways. Advisors, scholars, and even members of the clergy trained under Jesuit guidance often occupy positions where policy, ideology, and communication converge. When the Pope addresses the faithful from the balcony of St. Peter's, the words resonate not only with the weight of tradition, but also with carefully cultivated insights, historical perspective, and, at times, the unseen hand of Jesuit counsel. In this theatre of faith and authority, the Black Pope is not a spectator, but an architect, shaping the context in which decisions are made. Beyond Europe, the Jesuits' mastery of influence extends globally. Their network of schools, research centers, and humanitarian missions forms a lattice through which ideas flow silently. In Latin America, Asia, and Africa, Jesuit institutions mold leaders and guide communities, fostering both moral discernment and practical knowledge. In crises, from political upheavals to humanitarian emergencies, Jesuits often act as mediators, quietly observing, advising, and sometimes redirecting outcomes in ways that maintain balance while furthering long-term objectives. This subtlety is what makes the Jesuits uniquely powerful. They do not need to be seen to shape the world. They only need to ensure that those who rise to prominence carry with them the frameworks, values, and strategic thinking instilled in Jesuit formation. Whether in academia, government, or the Vatican itself, the impact of the order is pervasive yet invisible, a shadow that guides the course of events with patient precision. The Black Pope embodies this principle. He is neither a figure of spectacle nor a public diplomat. He is a strategist, a custodian of an intellectual and spiritual legacy, quietly ensuring that the Society of Jesus remains relevant, resilient, and influential. His authority reminds the world that power is not always in the spotlight. It is often in the quiet shaping of minds, in the orchestration of networks, and in the patient cultivation of ideas. In understanding the Jesuits, one begins to see that their mastery of influence is less about control and more about guidance. They have learned to move through time and society as observers and advisors, planting ideas, shaping leadership, and ensuring that history unfolds in ways subtly aligned with their vision. The Black Pope, as their unseen steward, ensures that this influence continues, quietly, inexorably, and profoundly, shaping the world from behind a veil few can ever fully perceive. In the aftermath of the 20th century's unprecedented devastation, as nations staggered beneath the weight of wars, revolutions, and ideological upheaval, one order quietly moved through the shadows, rebuilding not with fanfare but with precision. The Jesuits, whose influence had been cultivated over centuries, understood that the survival of ideas required patience, foresight, and an unwavering commitment to the long game. While political leaders scrambled to restore borders and economies, the Society of Jesus focused on a quieter, deeper restoration, the reconstruction of knowledge, institutions, and networks that could endure beyond the chaos. From Europe to the Americas, Africa, and Asia, Jesuit institutions began to rise again. Schools and universities reopened their doors, often modernized with the latest pedagogical approaches and technologies, yet infused with the same rigorous intellectual discipline that had defined the order since its founding. Each classroom became more than a site of learning. It became a node in a global web of influence, shaping future leaders in ways both subtle and profound. Students who passed through these halls were not only taught mathematics, philosophy, and theology. They were trained to understand society as a system, to navigate the currents of power, and to recognize the intricate interplay between morality, strategy, and leadership. In South America, the Jesuits expanded their presence quietly but decisively. From Argentina's bustling cities to the remote jungles of Brazil, missions, schools, and research centers emerged as sanctuaries of learning and hubs of social influence. Here, they cultivated minds that would later hold positions of authority in politics, education, and civil society, ensuring that the Jesuit philosophy of discernment and critical thinking permeated new generations. The same methodical approach was Miro, read in Africa and Asia, where Jesuit missions adapted to local cultures while maintaining a coherent global vision. Languages, customs, and traditions were respected and studied, allowing the Jesuits to embed themselves deeply within communities, building trust while subtly shaping ideas about leadership, ethics, and social responsibility. Yet their reconstruction was not only about education. The Jesuits were masters of infrastructure, strategy, and long-term planning. Libraries, observatories, and research institutions became quiet centers of knowledge, often invisible to the outside world, but connected through an intricate network of communication and coordination. Scientific research, philosophical inquiry, and theological study all flowed through these channels, creating a reservoir of insight and influence that could guide decisions across continents. They did not seek headlines or public acclaim. Their triumph lay in the unseen work of restoring continuity, knowledge, and discipline at a time when the world's structures were crumbling. This period also marked a modernization of Jesuit strategy. While maintaining centuries-old traditions of education, spiritual direction, and moral instruction, they integrated contemporary methods of communication, analysis, and pedagogy. Jesuit universities began attracting the elite and the aspiring alike, serving as bridges between social classes, political factions, and even nations. By embedding their philosophy in diverse regions and cultures, they ensured that no matter the turbulence above, the foundations of influence remained steady and deeply rooted. In essence, the Jesuits did not merely survive the upheavals of the modern age, they adapted and thrived. Their silent rebuilding was a masterclass in patience and foresight, demonstrating that true power often lies not in immediate recognition, but in enduring presence. Across continents, they quietly restored institutions, cultivated minds, and strengthened networks that would continue to influence global education, policy, and society for decades to come. In a world dazzled by reconstruction and spectacle, the Jesuits remind us that the most enduring victories are often the ones no one notices. Their work, invisible yet omnipresent, laid the groundwork for a subtle resurgence of influence, quietly guiding humanity through the chaos of history and proving once again that silence, strategy, and intellect can rebuild empires without a single flag being raised. Education is often imagined as a quiet process, confined to classrooms, textbooks, and lectures. But the Jesuits, masters of subtle influence, have long understood that shaping the mind is the most profound form of power. By the 20th century, their schools and universities had evolved far beyond the simple transmission of theology. Faith alone was no longer sufficient to guide a rapidly changing world. Instead, Jesuit education embraced philosophy, social sciences, ethics, and global awareness, cultivating thinkers capable of navigating the complex moral, political, and social dilemmas of modern society. Walking through a Jesuit university campus, one might first notice the architecture, grand yet understated, with libraries that seem to breathe centuries of knowledge. But the true architecture lies within the minds of students. Each lesson, each debate, and each reflection is carefully designed to instill critical thinking, discernment, and the ability to question assumptions while remaining grounded in values. Here, the study of Aristotle or Kant is not merely academic. It becomes a lens through which students examine justice, leadership, and the human condition. Moral reasoning is entwined with strategic thinking, producing individuals who can act decisively in moments of crisis, yet with a subtle understanding of long-term consequences. The Jesuits recognized early that influence grows quietly. Their classrooms were not merely for teaching subjects, they were incubators for leadership. Young minds from diverse backgrounds, often destined for positions of political, academic, or social authority, were trained to see the interconnectedness of society. Ethics were not abstract ideals, but operational principles, informing decisions about diplomacy, governance, and social reform. By guiding the moral compass of these emerging leaders, the Jesuits ensured that their philos, Sophie, permeated decisions that could shape nations and communities. Beyond ethics and philosophy, Jesuit education encouraged a global perspective. Students were taught languages, histories, and cultures far beyond their immediate surroundings, preparing them to operate in a world defined by interdependence. In Latin America, Asia, and Africa, Jesuit-educated leaders emerged who could navigate the tensions between tradition and modernization, between local needs and global pressures. Their classrooms became laboratories of human potential, where faith was integrated with reason, action, and empathy. Jesuit universities also cultivated a unique relationship between spirituality and civic responsibility. Students were encouraged to act not for personal gain, but for the greater good, to consider how their choices rippled through communities, nations, and even continents. Here, lessons in theology were paired with social research, public policy simulations, and leadership exercises. The goal was not mere academic excellence. It was the creation of individuals capable of influencing societies without ever wielding force, individuals who understood that shaping minds can alter the course of history more profoundly than armies ever could. In many ways, the success of Jesuit education lies in its subtlety. A young diplomat, a rising politician, or a future scientist may carry lessons learned in a quiet classroom into global decision-making rooms without ever realizing the depth of the influence guiding them. This is the genius of Jesuit pedagogy. By embedding principles of discernment, ethics, and global thinking early in life, they create networks of influence that operate silently yet decisively across generations. Faith, then, becomes more than scripture. It is integrated into reasoning, observation, and judgment. It shapes how leaders think, how societies are guided, and how decisions ripple through the unseen currents of human affairs. The Jesuits have shown that to influence the world, one need not march at the front of a crowd or command armies. Influence grows quietly, meticulously, in classrooms, in libraries, and in the formation of minds capable of shaping civilizations. In the quiet corridors of Jesuit institutions, knowledge and faith converge to produce individuals who can navigate the labyrinth of modern society. And in that convergence lies the secret of their enduring power, shaping not the world directly, but the minds that ultimately define it. Through education that transcends Scripture, the Jesuits ensure that their philosophy remains alive, adaptable, and profoundly influential in every corner of the globe. The image of Jesuits trudging through dense jungles, carrying crosses and Bibles to distant lands, is deeply ingrained in history. Yet, as the centuries unfolded, their mission transformed in ways few could have predicted. No longer confined to remote villages or solitary missions, the Society of Jesus evolved into an organization capable of subtle, far-reaching influence. The world around them had changed. Empires were falling, nations rising, and global politics demanded a sophistication that brute force alone could never achieve. In this new era, Jesuits became educators, advisors, and strategists, quietly embedding themselves at the intersections of power, knowledge, and faith. Their transition from missionaries to strategists was neither abrupt nor accidental. Each step was deliberate, guided by centuries of intellectual tradition and the rigorous discipline of the order. In classrooms and seminaries, Jesuits trained not only priests, but also thinkers and diplomats who would one day shape policy and society. They mastered philosophy, logic, rhetoric, and ethics, understanding that influence begins in the mind before it manifests in action. By nurturing a generation capable of critical thought and moral discernment, they ensured that their ideals would resonate far beyond the walls of their institutions. Yet their strategy was not confined to education. Jesuits became advisors in courts, governments, and international organizations, often in roles invisible to the public eye. In Latin America, Africa, and Asia, they counseled leaders on diplomacy, social reform, and governance, always weaving their influence subtly through ideas rather than mandates. Their unique position allowed them to guide the course of nations without ever seizing official power, shaping policies and public opinion with the quiet authority of intellect and moral guidance. At the heart of this, influence was a paradox. Jesuits take a vow of absolute obedience to the Pope, yet they operate with remarkable autonomy across the globe. This obedience does not limit their reach. Rather, it provides a framework of loyalty that allows coordinated action across continents. Whether navigating the corridors of a university in Europe, advising a fledgling government in Africa, or mediating conflicts in Latin America, Jesuits balance fidelity to their spiritual mission with an uncanny ability to engage with the secular world. Their loyalty to the Pope becomes a tool for cohesion, ensuring that their strategies, though widespread, remain disciplined and consistent. History offers striking examples of this duality. While some Jesuits advocated for social reforms and peacemaking, others quietly educated future leaders who would later assume political, military, or corporate authority. It is not that they sought to control every outcome. Rather, they understood that influence is most potent when distributed, subtle, and untraceable. They operate like chess players who place pieces in precise positions, anticipating moves decades in advance, all while remaining largely unseen. Even in the modern era, their reach extends to think tanks, research councils, and international forums where ideas, not weapons, shape the future. Jesuits may not draft constitutions or sign treaties, but their philosophy, ethics, and strategic guidance often underpin the decisions of those who do. And in a world increasingly defined by information, ideology, and networks of influence, their ability to operate behind the scenes has never been more powerful. Ultimately, the transformation from missionaries to strategists illustrates the enduring genius of the Society of Jesus. By combining faith, education, and disciplined observation, they have become architects of influence, quietly directing the flow of power across nations and generations. Their impact is not measured in battles won or territories conquered, but in the minds shaped, the leaders guided, and the subtle currents of society redirected. In a sense, the world today is a vast chessboard, and the Jesuits, once humble missionaries, are the quiet strategists orchestrating moves few even recognize. Their power is invisible, their influence profound, and their methods timeless. While the world debates who rules openly, the true mastery lies in the shadows, where ideas, faith, and strategy converge to shape history without ever announcing their presence. In the heart of the Society of Jesus lies a figure whose authority is both immense and invisible: the Superior General. Known among whispered circles as the Black Pope, this individual is more than a spiritual leader. He is the strategist, the observer, and the quiet architect of the Order's global influence. From his seat, he oversees a network that stretches across continents, encompassing schools, missions, research institutions, and countless informal connections in every corner of society. The Superior General is not concerned with headlines or public acclaim. His power lies in understanding the subtle currents of human thought, cultural shifts, and political evolution, often decades before the rest of the world even perceives them. Each Jesuit institution, from the grandest European university to a remote South American mission, functions as a node in a vast intelligence network. Letters, reports, and observations flow upward, giving the Superior General a panoramic view of humanity, its hopes, fears, conflicts, and aspirations. With this information, he can forecast trends in politics, social movements, and the cultural landscape. The Order's meticulous record-keeping and emphasis on rigorous observation allow him to discern patterns invisible to ordinary leaders, making his influence both silent and profound. Historically, the Superior General's reach extended far beyond the spiritual realm. Jesuits were pioneers in astronomy, mathematics, and philosophy, often at the forefront of intellectual innovation. Their contributions were not only academic, they were tools for shaping the broader trajectory of human thought. Galileo, threatened by religious authorities for challenging established cosmologies, found sanctuary and subtle support from Jesuit scholars who understood the transformative power of knowledge. The Order protected thinkers, nurtured curiosity, and ensured that ideas capable of reshaping the world survived the scrutiny of dogma. It is within this duality, faith and intellect, that the Superior General exercises his influence. By cultivating minds, safeguarding knowledge, and guiding decisions in courts, universities, and mission halls, he becomes a silent force behind the evolution of societies. His vision is long-term. He does not seek immediate victories, but patiently shapes frameworks that endure for generations. While kings and presidents rise and fall, the Superior General's strategies ripple through time, quietly guiding outcomes in ways that often escape historical record. Yet his authority is not merely intellectual, it is profoundly human. Jesuit philosophy emphasizes discernment, empathy, and the careful weighing of options. The Superior General does not impose but advises, cultivating leaders who internalize his guidance, often without realizing the source. From the classrooms of Europe to the universities of the Americas and Asia, students trained under Jesuit pedagogy carry forward principles of leadership, ethics, and critical thought. These leaders, politicians, scholars, and innovators, become extensions of the Order's influence, guided subtly by a hand that never steps into the spotlight. In times of crisis, the Superior General's role becomes even more vital. Wars, revolutions, and social upheavals are not met with weapons or coercion, but with counsel, mediation, and strategic insight. Jesuits embedded within governments, religious institutions, and cultural organizations provide him with real-time perspectives, allowing for rapid adaptation while maintaining the Order's long-term vision. He moves in shadows, orchestrating influence through intellect and networks rather than force, embodying a form of power both ancient and profoundly modern. The rise of the Superior General is, in essence, the rise of an unseen hand guiding human history. Through education, philosophy, science, and diplomacy, he ensures the Society of Jesus remains relevant, adaptable, and quietly formidable. His influence stretches across generations, affecting not only immediate decisions, but the very way societies understand knowledge, morality, and authority. The Black Pope does not seek dominion through armies or wealth. He achieves it through the enduring power of ideas, foresight, and disciplined strategy. In every classroom, council, and mission he oversees, the Superior General's presence is felt without being seen. He embodies the paradox of the Jesuits. Absolute obedience paired with global strategy, spiritual devotion paired with intellectual mastery. And through this quiet, persistent guidance, the Society of Jesus continues to shape the currents of history, one mind, one institution, and one subtle intervention at a time. In the quiet corridors of Jesuit schools, the libraries of their universities, and the remote mission outposts scattered across continents, a profound truth has been nurtured for centuries. Knowledge is the ultimate form of power. While empires rose and fell, armies clashed, and revolutions tore societies apart, the Jesuits moved in silence, wielding influence not with guns or banners, but with ideas, education, and careful observation. Their power was intangible, yet formidable, embedded in the minds of those who would shape the future, from rulers to thinkers, soldiers to diplomats. From the earliest days of the order, Jesuits recognized that control over information was control over outcomes. Missionaries in South America meticulously documented cultures, geography, and local politics, creating a repository of understanding that would inform decisions long before any foreign empire could assert dominion. In Europe, Jesuit scholars taught rhetoric, philosophy, and critical thinking, cultivating generations capable of navigating complex social and political landscapes. The order did not seek to dominate overtly. Instead, they trained others to think in ways that aligned with Jesuit values, producing leaders who would unknowingly extend their influence into governments, courts, and academies. Throughout the 20th century, as global conflict reshaped nations and ideologies collided, the Jesuits proved remarkably adept at survival. While kingdoms crumbled, dictators rose and fell, and wars left cities in ruin, Jesuit institutions quietly observed, recorded, and advised. They were present in the corridors of power without being the focus of headlines. They provided guidance to rulers, mediated disputes, and educated the children of political elites, ensuring that the next generation carried the lessons and worldview cultivated under Jesuit tutelage. Their influence was sub directo, yet it endured far longer than armies and treaties. In moments of revolution, when violence threatened to consume entire nations, Jesuits understood the value of information over force. They collected intelligence not through espionage in the modern sense, but through human connection, the trusted confessions of a soldier, the insights of a local leader, the careful analysis of cultural patterns. With these threads of understanding, the order could predict trends, advise wisely, and at times prevent disasters that might have otherwise gone unchecked. Their network extended across continents, from the Andes to the Congo, from Asia's urban centers to Africa's remote villages, allowing them to act with a precision invisible to outsiders. What made their power enduring was not secrecy alone, but the disciplined way they integrated knowledge into action. Jesuit education emphasized discernment, critical reasoning, and the capacity to weigh outcomes across decades. A single well-informed mind, trained in this philosophy, could shape policy, sway public opinion, or even redirect the course of a rebellion. Knowledge became a currency more valuable than gold or weapons, because it allowed the Jesuits to influence not only decisions, but the very way those decisions were conceived. Even in the most tumultuous periods, from the rise of authoritarian regimes in South America to the ideological battles of the Cold War, the Jesuits navigated treacherous waters with remarkable resilience. They were advisors to kings and presidents, educators of revolutionaries and generals alike, and mediators in conflicts that threatened to spiral into chaos. Their role was never visible, yet their fingerprints appear across history, hidden in treaties, embedded in educational curricula, and whispered in the policies of nations. Ultimately, the Jesuits transformed information into power by mastering its collection, preservation, and application. They understood that knowledge, once imparted thoughtfully, could shape generations and guide societies in ways that brute force never could. In their hands, ideas became strategies, education became influence, and observation became authority. And through this quiet, deliberate stewardship, the Society of Jesus ensured that while the world around them often burned, their influence remained unscathed, resilient, enduring, and profoundly unseen. As the world entered the shadow of nuclear standoff and ideological confrontation, the Cold War became a global chessboard. Nations maneuvered with armies, spies, and treaties, while ideology itself became a weapon. Amid this tense landscape, the Jesuits moved quietly, positioning themselves at both ends of the spectrum, not to choose sides, but to ensure influence wherever history might turn. Their neutrality was not born of indecision. It was a strategy honed over centuries, a recognition that power often comes not from allegiance, but from omnipresence. In the cities of South America, from the bustling streets of Buenos Aires to the mountains of Chile, Jesuit educators and priests were already embedded in society. They taught the children of military officers while mentoring young revolutionaries, fostering dialogue and observation in equal measure. The order's schools produced thinkers, planners, and orators, future leaders whose decisions would ripple across nations. In those classrooms, debates on Marxism and capitalism, socialism and liberalism were encouraged not to promote ideology, but to cultivate discernment, an ability to understand every current of thought and every force of action shaping the world. Behind closed doors, Jesuit missionaries and scholars acted as observers, noting shifts in loyalty, ideology, and popular sentiment. Reports, often painstakingly detailed, traveled through the order's network to the headquarters in Rome, providing a window into societies undergoing tumultuous change. Some historians suggest that these reports were quietly shared, without fanfare, with intelligence agencies seeking insight into revolutions, uprisings, and regime shifts. While there is no definitive evidence of formal alliances, patterns of Jesuit placement, near-revolutionary cells alongside government elites and within international institutions suggest a careful strategy: be everywhere, influence subtly, and survive. The paradox of Jesuit engagement during the Cold War is striking. On one side, priests and teachers stood with liberation movements advocating social justice, aligning with Marxist ideals to empower the disenfranchised. On the other, Jesuit alumni and advisors were seated in government ministries, military councils, and diplomatic corps, shaping policy from the inside. Their philosophy did not compel them to pick sides. It compelled them to understand, to document, and to educate, ensuring that regardless of who held power, Jesuit principles and influence remained resilient. This dual presence was not without moral tension. Jesuit clergy witnessed violence, oppression, and upheaval firsthand. They counseled leaders while also offering spiritual guidance to those fighting against them. Some engaged directly with the poor and marginalized, advocating reform and equity, while others operated in elite circles where decisions about coups, counterinsurgency, and economic policy were debated. In every instance, discretion was paramount. The order's strength lay in invisibility, the ability to observe, advise, and subtly shape events without ever drawing attention. Even as global superpowers vied for dominance, the Jesuits' enduring focus remained on education and discernment. They nurtured young minds in boarding schools, universities, and seminaries, instilling the capacity to analyze, debate, and lead. These students would grow into political advisors, journalists, academics, and strategists, positions from which they could implement change. By embedding themselves in the intellectual and moral formation of the next generation, the Jesuits ensured that influence outlasted ideology, transcending the fleeting victories of either East or West. In essence, during the Cold War, the Jesuits demonstrated the power of being omnipresent yet unseen. While governments threatened each other with missiles and spies risked lives in the shadows, the order quietly built networks of knowledge and influence. They didn't need armies or propaganda. Their tools were classrooms, libraries, and confessional guidance. Ideas became instruments of resilience, and education became a battlefield far more enduring than any war front. Through this strategy, the Jesuits survived the ideological turbulence of the 20th century, emerging unscathed while the world around them fractured. They did not fight for flags, but for the cultivation of minds capable of navigating history's storms. And in that quiet, deliberate presence, they revealed a truth both profound and unsettling. Sometimes the most enduring power in the world is not wielded openly. It is observed, nurtured, and quietly placed in the hands of those who will unknowingly carry it forward. In the shadowy corridors of Cold War geopolitics, information was as valuable as bullets, and intelligence became the invisible currency of power. Amidst this clandestine world, the Jesuits operated quietly, not as operatives, but as educators, observers, and custodians of knowledge. Across Latin America, their schools and missions cultivated minds that would one day sit in government offices, lead social movements, and at times enter the corridors of international intelligence. The question that lingers today is subtle yet provocative. Did Jesuits, knowingly or not, play a role in shaping the intelligence networks of the modern era? While no documented formal ties exist, testimonies from former operatives, scholars, and local witnesses hint at a remarkable pattern. Jesuit educators nurtured young men who would later become CIA analysts, diplomats, and agents, teaching them principles of logic, strategy, and social observation. In classrooms where theology intertwined with philosophy, rhetoric, and ethics, students learned to read human behavior, to anticipate movements, and to understand the subtle currents that drive societies. These were not lessons in espionage, but in discernment, the ability to perceive hidden structures, the invisible forces shaping the world. In the post-war decades, as Cold War tensions gripped Latin America, Jesuit missionaries and teachers were strategically positioned. They moved through urban centers and remote villages alike, observing political shifts, economic pressures, and the rise of revolutionary movements. Their influence was quietly pervasive. Leaders of resistance movements were often former students, clergy offered counsel to local politicians, and Jesuit alumni found themselves inside government ministries and policy circles. Information flowed subtly through confessions, classroom debates, and personal mentorship, forming a web of insight few outsiders could perceive. Some scholars argue that in such a context, intelligence agencies could not have ignored Jesuit networks. While there was no formal recruitment, CIA officers entering Latin America often shared educational backgrounds with Jesuit-trained analysts, giving them an uncanny understanding of the region's social dynamics. Jesuits, on their part, remained devoted to education and faith, yet their meticulous observations, recorded in diaries, letters, and reports, offered insight into both revolutionary fervor and governmental strategies. In effect, the order provided a reservoir of knowledge that intelligence operatives could tap into, intentionally or otherwise. This connection is paradoxical, yet consistent with Jesuit philosophy. They never wielded power directly. They cultivated it in others. By educating both the children of elite military leaders and the sons of impoverished revolutionaries, the Jesuits ensured they were present wherever influence emerged. Their classrooms became laboratories of human behavior, their guidance shaping both idealists and pragmatists. In a world where loyalty shifted rapidly and ideology divided nations, the order's neutrality was its greatest asset. They could be allies to all without ever appearing to pick a side. Historical episodes amplify this quiet connection. In Chile, Argentina, and Paraguay, Jesuit-educated figures found themselves central to revolutionary planning or governmental policy, often overlapping with American intelligence interests. Their Jesuit training emphasized careful discernment, critical thinking, and ethical reasoning, providing them with the tools to navigate morally complex scenarios, skills equally valuable to agents and diplomats. Though the order maintained spiritual aims, the unintended consequence was a subtle alignment with intelligence networks across the hemisphere. The significance of this understated connection lies not in overt conspiracies, but in the power of education and observation. Jesuits never needed badges, weapons, or uniforms to influence the course of nations. They operated through minds, through mentorship, and through the cultivation of networks that extended far beyond convent walls. CIA analysts, diplomats, and political strategists may have benefited from this silent pedagogy, Yet the true architects remained unseen, living in quiet monasteries and university halls, chronicling, mentoring, and subtly guiding. In the end, the question is less about collusion and more about impact. The Jesuits shaped the social and political fabric of Latin America across centuries, planting seeds in classrooms and parishes that would bloom in unexpected ways. From revolutionary movements to intelligence briefings, their influence quietly threaded through the modern history of the Americas. And in that quiet thread, one realizes that power often does not announce itself with flags or speeches. It whispers, it observes, and it patiently waits for history to turn in its favor. In quiet classrooms across continents, the foundations of power were being laid, not with swords or mandates, but with books, lessons, and disciplined guidance. Jesuit schools, with their centuries-old traditions, had mastered the art of shaping minds, blending intellectual rigor with moral contemplation and strategy with spirituality. Within these walls, students were not merely learning arithmetic, literature, or theology. They were being taught how to see the world as a system, how to navigate its currents, and sometimes, how to steer them. The Jesuit educational philosophy was subtle yet profound. Pupils were trained to think critically, to question assumptions, and to anticipate consequences. Logic was paired with rhetoric. Ethics were intertwined with leadership exercises. Classical philosophy merged with social observation. Every lesson, every debate, every mentorship session carried a latent lesson in influence and discernment. The curriculum was more than knowledge. It was preparation for a life in which decisions could reverberate across cities, nations, and even continents. For many students, this education became a roadmap for leadership. Some rose to the highest offices in government, others commanded corporate empires, and a few became architects of social movements. In Latin America, a surprising pattern emerged. Numerous authoritarian leaders and revolutionary figures had spent formative years under Jesuit tutelage. Fidel Castro of Cuba, Alfredo Stroessner of Paraguay, and Rafael Trujillo of the Dominican Republic all had walked the halls of Jesuit institutions, absorbing lessons in discipline, persuasion, and strategy. It was not indoctrination in tyranny, but an education in structure, clarity, and influence, and the outcomes depended on the intentions of the student. Jesuit schools emphasized the cultivation of character alongside intellect. Students learned humility, service, and reflection, yet these virtues were taught alongside a keen awareness of human ambition and societal mechanics. They were taught to observe, to understand motivations, to navigate complex hierarchies, and to act decisively when necessary. In essence, they were learning how to lead, how to inspire, and how to shape outcomes without overt coercion. A well-placed word, a well-constructed argument, or a nuanced ethical stance could influence entire populations. These were the invisible tools of leadership that Jesuits imparted. The paradox was striking. In classrooms devoted to faith and morality, students were also learning strategies that could be wielded for control or liberation. Jesuits did not create dictators. They created disciplined minds capable of navigating complex power structures. Some students applied their skills to ideals of justice and equality, others to consolidation of authority. The difference lay not in the education, but in the choices of those who received it. And yet, the subtle fingerprint of Jesuit pedagogy could be traced in their decisions. The patience, the strategic thinking, the awareness of perception, and the ability to influence without overt force. This system of education extended beyond political leaders. Scholars, scientists, executives, and clerics alike were molded through this approach. Jesuit institutions became laboratories for cultivating a generation capable of shaping societies. Across Europe, the Americas, Africa, and Asia, the silent influence of these schools rippled outward. Alumni carried forward lessons in analytical thought, ethical reasoning, and the art of subtle influence, often unaware of the wider historical patterns in which their education played a role. Ultimately, The Jesuit approach to education was a testament to the belief that true power resides in the mind. Armies can be defeated, empires can fall, but a cultivated intellect, disciplined, ethical, and strategic, can endure, influence, and quietly shape the course of history. In the hushed halls of Jesuit schools, the future was being quietly engineered, one mind at a time, leaving a mark on the world that would remain invisible to most but undeniable to those who understood the ripple of influence. March 13th, 2013, a date that seemed ordinary to the casual observer. Yet within the hallowed walls of the Vatican, a quiet revolution had taken place. For the first time in the Church's nearly 2,000-year history, the white throne of the papacy was claimed by a man from the Society of Jesus, a Jesuit. Cardinal Jorge Mario Bergoglio, now Pope Francis, stepped onto the balcony, greeted by a sea of cameras and faithful pilgrims. Yet behind that public moment lay decades of meticulous preparation, unseen influence, and a subtle reshaping of the Vatican's inner dynamics. The election of a Jesuit pope was more than a spiritual appointment. It was a symbolic assertion of an order long trained in strategy, diplomacy, and education. For centuries, the Jesuits had cultivated a philosophy of quiet influence, placing their men in advisory roles, academic positions, and missions across continents. Their presence in the Vatican had always been powerful, yet discreet. Now, for the first time, one of their own held the ultimate visible authority. Though the true mechanisms of control, the invisible threads of policy, counsel, and ideology, remained carefully hidden. Pope Francis embodies the paradox of Jesuit influence: public humility paired with strategic insight. The gestures of simplicity, the emphasis on compassion, and the calls for social justice resonate globally, yet behind every initiative, every diplomatic overture, lie advisors, analysts, and networks honed over centuries. Jesuit education emphasizes discernment, strategic patience, and understanding the human heart, qualities that allow a leader to appear reactive and pastoral while quietly steering complex systems. In this, the election of Pope Francis was both a culmination and a continuation of a centuries-long strategy, the order moving from the shadows to the center without ever relinquishing subtle control, the white throne. He has always symbolized spiritual authority, but for the Jesuits, it also became a focal point for orchestrating influence. The decisions made within these walls, ranging from appointments of cardinals to global initiatives on climate, migration, and social policy, are informed by a network of Jesuit-trained minds embedded worldwide. Young cardinals educated in Jesuit institutions, scholars advising international councils, and even diplomats guided by Jesuit philosophy all contribute to a quiet ecosystem of influence that extends far beyond Rome. Yet the history of this quiet power is older than Pope Francis himself. The Vatican, in collaboration with certain Jesuit networks, played a controversial role during the chaotic years following World War II. As Nazi officers and collaborators fled Europe, complex escape routes, known unofficially as rat lines, guided them through Italian, Austrian, and Spanish corridors to South America. Jesuit priests, sometimes quietly aiding with papers or safe havens, operated within these humanitarian and religious frameworks, providing a conduit for figures who would later be absorbed into U.S. intelligence initiatives like Operation Paperclip. These clandestine acts were rationalized as service to a higher geopolitical purpose: the containment of communism, the stabilization of postwar Europe, and the strategic repositioning of intellectual and military assets. Pope Francis, consciously or symbolically, represents the culmination of centuries of strategic thinking and silent maneuvering. While history debates the morality of past interventions, there is no doubt that the Jesuits perfected the art of long-term influence, positioning themselves in moments when global events could be subtly guided without ever appearing to interfere. The election of a Jesuit pope did not signal the end of secrecy. Rather, it highlighted the duality of visible and invisible power. As he speaks from St. Peter's balcony, calling for humility, justice, and care for the marginalized, the world watches. But in those words, carefully chosen and echoed through centuries of Jesuit thought, lies a deeper truth. True power is often invisible. It does not require spectacle or violence. It moves quietly, patiently, like a river carving its path beneath the surface, shaping the world in ways unseen yet enduring. Pope Francis's papacy is not merely the story of one man. It is the story of an order whose influence has silently guided the currents of history, now stepping onto the stage while keeping the strings behind the curtain firmly in hand. Stretching from the windswept plains of Patagonia to the dense, unending Amazon, South America has always been a land of contrasts. Towering mountains clash with sprawling rainforests, ancient civilizations whisper their secrets beneath the soil, and vibrant cultures emerge from centuries of conquest, colonization, and revolution. Yet behind the visible struggles of nations, another story unfolds, a story of influence, subtle guidance, and quiet strategy. At the heart of this story lies the Society of Jesus, whose presence in South America has long shaped both faith and society in ways that remain largely unseen. From the earliest Jesuit reductions in Paraguay to sprawling missions in Brazil and Peru, the order's influence was both spiritual and practical. These missions were more than centers of worship. They were carefully designed experiments in social organization. Indigenous communities were guided, educated, and organized under Jesuit supervision, and in doing so, the Jesuits learned the intricate workings of local culture, politics, and human behavior. The knowledge gained in these missions would echo through centuries, equipping the order with the tools to subtly influence the region long after colonial empires faded. As nations gained independence in the 19th century, the Jesuits did not vanish. They adapted. They became advisors to emerging governments, educators of elite children, and at times mediators in times of political unrest. In the turbulent 20th century, when military coups, dictatorships, and revolutionary movements rocked the continent, Jesuits were present on multiple fronts, sometimes advocating for social justice, at other times quietly mentoring future leaders in elite classrooms. Their neutrality was not accidental, it was strategic. By maintaining presence across ideological divides, they could ensure influence regardless of which faction ultimately prevailed. Consider Chile in 1973, when President Salvador Allende, the world's first democratically elected Marxist leader, was overthrown. Jesuits had existed in multiple roles: priests aligned with social reform, teachers of military leaders, and advisors within governmental structures. Their silent observation, mentorship, and education meant that even in times of violent upheaval, their networks remained intact. In Argentina, during the infamous Dirty War, Jesuits endured both persecution and moral dilemmas, navigating the dangerous waters between speaking out and maintaining survival, all while continuing to shape minds through education and counsel. Yet their influence extended beyond the political. Jesuit humanitarian missions across South America offered medical care, education, and spiritual guidance to displaced populations, refugee communities, and underserved regions. Beneath the surface of these noble acts, the Jesuits quietly gathered knowledge, understanding societal tensions, mapping networks of power, and observing the evolution of ideology. Humanitarian care became not just a service to the soul, but a subtle instrument of insight. In every classroom taught, every school built, and every clinic opened, Jesuits were quietly sculpting the social and intellectual landscape of the continent. The paradox of South America is clear. The continent has seen both liberation and oppression, wealth and inequality, spiritual devotion, and political manipulation. Through it all, the Jesuits have remained a constant force, not always visible, never loud, yet profoundly influential. From revolutionaries like Fidel Castro and Salvador Allende's allies, to elite politicians, military officers, and civil leaders, countless figures have passed through Jesuit-guided institutions, absorbing principles of leadership, ethics, and strategy. In this paradox, the Jesuits reveal their enduring philosophy. Power is not seized through force alone, but cultivated through education, observation, and strategic patience. South America, with its intricate weave of politics, culture, and faith, became a living classroom, a place where the Society of Jesus honed the art of subtle influence. Even today, as social movements rise, governments falter, and ideologies collide, the quiet echoes of Jesuit guidance continue to shape the continent, proving that true influence often moves like water, invisible, patient, yet impossible to divert. In the quiet halls of Jesuit schools, the sound of pencils scratching on paper and the murmurs of philosophical debate might seem ordinary. Yet beneath this surface lies a careful orchestration of thought, strategy, and discipline, a curriculum designed not merely to educate, but to shape minds capable of understanding and influencing the world. For nearly 5 centuries, the Society of Jesus has perfected this method. Power is cultivated not with armies or weapons, but through intellect, character, and strategic insight. From the sprawling campuses of Georgetown University in the United States to remote mission schools in Latin America, Jesuit education has always sought to blend knowledge with discernment. Students are taught theology and philosophy alongside mathematics, logic, and rhetoric, learning not just to memorize, but to question, analyze, and persuade. This rigorous intellectual training instills in young minds the confidence to navigate complex systems, the ability to read human behavior, and the foresight to anticipate consequences. Every lesson, every debate, every carefully crafted assignment is a brick in the foundation of influence. History demonstrates the quiet potency of this approach. Revolutionary leaders, political figures, and business moguls often share a common thread: early education under Jesuit guidance. Fidel Castro, who would later shape the destiny of Cuba, walked the corridors of Jesuit classrooms in Havana, learning the power of rhetoric, organization, and disciplined thought. Alfredo Stroessner of Paraguay, Rafael Trujillo of the Dominican Republic, and countless other figures similarly absorbed the principles of leadership and strategy in Jesuit institutions, developing the tools to command loyalty, anticipate opposition, and mold societies according to their vision. Yet the goal of Jesuit education is not to create tyrants. It is to cultivate understanding, discernment, and responsibility. The paradox lies in the hands of the student. Some use these tools to uplift communities, others to dominate. In every case, the Jesuits provide a framework, a disciplined mind, an ethical lens, and an appreciation for the complexity of human systems. It is a silent form of power, the ability to shape a world without firing a shot, to influence a generation without ever being in the limelight. Modern Jesuit institutions extend this philosophy globally. In Africa, Asia, and Europe, schools and universities founded by the order continue to produce leaders equipped with global awareness, ethical reasoning, and strategic thinking. Curriculum is tailored not only to academic excellence, but to forming individuals capable of navigating political, social, and cultural complexities. Humanitarian projects, social justice programs, and community leadership initiatives supplement classroom instruction, giving students practical experience in managing real-world challenges while maintaining moral clarity. The Jesuits' influence does not rely on secrecy alone, but on persistence and precision. They do not deploy soldiers to assert control, they deploy ideas. Through debate, mentorship, and disciplined study, they cultivate foresight and adaptability. When graduates rise to positions of power, whether as policymakers, corporate executives, or social reformers, they carry with them a subtle imprint of Jesuit philosophy. The belief that knowledge, morality, and strategic thinking can shape outcomes far beyond their immediate reach. This approach reveals the essence of Jesuit power, invisible yet pervasive. In a modern world obsessed with weapons, armies, and visible displays of strength, the order demonstrates that enduring influence stems from minds trained to think, adapt, and act with precision. It is an architecture of intellect where the true instruments of power are ideas, relationships, and foresight. By focusing on the mind rather than the blade, Jesuits have ensured that their reach extends far beyond the classroom walls. Generations of leaders, thinkers, and strategists have carried their lessons into every sphere of human endeavor. And so, in the quiet discipline of study, in the careful cultivation of intellect, the Society of Jesus continues its centuries-old mission. training minds, not weapons, and quietly guiding the currents of history from behind the scenes. In classrooms bathed in sunlight, with the faint scent of old books lingering in the air, the Jesuits have long cultivated an environment where intellect meets discipline. These are not ordinary schools. They are carefully designed crucibles where young minds are honed, trained to think critically, and guided to understand the delicate mechanics of power. For centuries, the Society of Jesus has believed that influence begins with the education of the next generation, and history shows just how profuse and this influence can be. Many of the 20th century's most controversial leaders passed through Jesuit halls as students. Fidel Castro, whose revolution would transform Cuba, spent his formative years absorbing the structure, logic, and rhetoric that would later define his rise. Rafael Trujillo of the Dominican Republic, Alfredo Stroessner of Paraguay, and even François Duvalier of Haiti, figures whose names evoke both power and fear, also walked corridors where Jesuits instilled discipline, strategy, and a deep understanding of human psychology. The paradox is striking. Institutions rooted in faith and moral education often served as the proving ground for men who would wield extraordinary authority, for better or worse. Yet the Jesuits themselves did not create tyrants. Their mission has never been to decide how power is used, but to shape minds capable of navigating complexity. Through rigorous study in philosophy, ethics, rhetoric, and logic, students learned to perceive the world as a system of interlocking choices and consequences. They were taught not just to think, but to observe, interpret, and act strategically. In doing so, the order planted seeds of influence that could grow in any direction, depending on the choices of those who held them. This duality defines the enduring mystery of Jesuit education. On one hand, it fosters moral reasoning, social awareness, and a commitment to service. On the other, it equips students with the tools to command, persuade, and lead on an unprecedented scale. The outcome is never predetermined. Some graduates devote their lives to the common good, applying Jesuit teachings to governance, social reform, or humanitarian work. Others, like certain authoritarian leaders, harness these same skills to dominate, control, and reshape nations according to their own vision. The education itself remains neutral, yet its consequences reverberate across history. Jesuit influence is not limited to political leaders. In fields as diverse as science, finance, diplomacy, and culture, alumni of Jesuit institutions occupy positions of authority, shaping decisions and narratives without ever being noticed. It is a quiet form of power, one that does not require armies or legislation. Instead, it relies on foresight, discernment, and the ability to understand and guide human behavior, a subtle hand steering the direction of events from behind the scenes. The election of Pope Francis, the first Jesuit to ascend to the papacy, symbolizes this culmination of influence. He represents both a renewal of faith and a visible acknowledgement of an order that has long operated in the shadows. From classrooms to cathedrals, from missions to global institutions, Jesuits have quietly prepared generations to act, think, and lead in ways that ripple far beyond their immediate surroundings. Francis's leadership is a testament not only to his personal vision, but to centuries of educational philosophy that emphasizes discernment, strategy, and ethical reasoning. In the end, Jesuit education demonstrates that power is less about force than it is about preparation. It is a doctrine of patience, subtlety, and foresight. By shaping minds rather than armies, the Society of Jesus has left a mark on history that is profound, pervasive, and often invisible. The world may remember the names of dictators and revolutionaries, but the silent architects behind their intellect, those who taught them to think, reason, and strategize, remain largely unseen. And therein lies the enduring legacy of the Jesuits, the cultivation of influence in its purest, most enduring form. The world emerged from the ruins of the Second World War with a collective sigh of relief. Yet beneath the rubble, shadows were still moving. Across Europe, whispers circulated about the disappearance of notorious figures, scientists, officers, and war criminals whose names had become synonymous with terror. Many vanished without trace, leaving historians puzzled and families haunted. And behind this silence, some researchers have traced a curious thread. The covert networks often linked to religious orders, particularly the Jesuits. Long before modern intelligence agencies dominated global intrigue, the Jesuits had mastered the art of moving quietly, observing carefully, and influencing events without drawing attention. In the chaotic aftermath of Europe's devastation, their centuries-old infrastructure of monasteries, missions, and ecclesiastical offices became an unlikely conduit for clandestine movement. Routes that would later be called the rat lines stretched from Austria, Italy, and Spain to distant South American countries, Argentina, Brazil, and Paraguay, guiding individuals far from the reach of war tribunals. It was not merely a matter of geography. Each monastery, each convent, acted as a temporary sanctuary under the protection of religious immunity. Priests and monks offered food, shelter, and documentation that could erase identities on paper. Refugee passports, humanitarian certificates, and discreet guidance allowed these individuals to cross borders undetected. The Jesuits, with their decades of experience in global mobility and local networks, were uniquely positioned to provide this support. They did not advertise these operations. They worked in the quiet spaces between the visible and the hidden, balancing morality with pragmatism. Historians debate the motivations behind these actions. Some argue it was simple human compassion, an effort to save lives in the aftermath of unimaginable violence. Others suggest strategic reasoning played a role. Certain individuals possessed skills, knowledge, or intelligence deemed valuable in the new geopolitical landscape. Scientists, engineers, and administrators who had once served oppressive regimes were quietly funneled into programs like Operation Paperclip in the United States, their expertise harnessed for post-war reconstruction and the looming Cold War. The Jesuits' role was not just logistical, it was a silent, moral, and operational calculus in a world reassembling itself. South America became the final stage for many of these journeys. Countries like Argentina and Brazil, already fertile ground for Jesuit missions and schools, welcomed the newcomers under the guise of ordinary immigration. Local communities, often guided by clergy who had themselves been trained in the Jesuit tradition of discretion and influence, integrated these arrivals into society. These regions, already steeped in political and social complexity, became intertwined with global currents of knowledge, power, and influence, all moving quietly beneath the surface of public attention. Yet the Ratlines were not a simple story of hiding and exile. They symbolized the enduring reach of networks cultivated over centuries. An order trained in observation, strategy, and human behavior could operate where conventional power had faltered. Monasteries were no longer just centers of prayer. They were nodes in a web that extended across continents, connecting individuals, information, and influence. The Jesuits had learned long ago that survival required adaptability, patience, and discretion. The Ratlines were a post-war manifestation of that philosophy, a bridge between chaos and order, morality and pragmatism, visibility and shadow. Even today, the story of the Ratlines remains partially obscured. Official records are scarce, many accounts are anecdotal, and the line between myth and fact blurs. But the pattern is undeniable. Wherever there was movement, Jesuit networks were often nearby, guiding, observing, and shaping outcomes from the shadows. In this delicate balance between faith, morality, and strategy, the Society of Jesus demonstrated again that true influence does not shout, it whispers. In the aftermath of humanity's darkest hour, when nations struggled to rebuild and the world's conscience wrestled with justice, the Jesuits operated quietly, efficiently, and decisively. The Ratlines are a testament to their enduring philosophy. Power is not in force, but in the subtle orchestration of movement, knowledge, and human networks. In the corridors of monasteries and the quiet halls of Europe's churches, history was still being written, silently, invisibly, and with profound consequence. The end of World War II marked not just a military victory, but the beginning of a new, silent contest for knowledge and technological supremacy. Amid the rubble of Europe, minds once dedicated to destruction became the most valuable currency for nations plotting the future. Operation Paperclip, the US initiative to secure Nazi scientists for its burgeoning aerospace and defense programs, has long been analyzed in history books. Yet behind the familiar narratives of government programs and intelligence operations, an unlikely participant looms in the shadows, the Vatican. It may seem counterintuitive. A religious institution, centuries old, devoted to faith and doctrine, intersecting with the world of rocketry, nuclear physics, and wartime intelligence. But the Vatican, particularly certain monastic orders with deep networks and centuries of logistical experience, provided more than spiritual refuge. They offered an intricate web of sanctuary and documentation. Monasteries, seminaries, and Jesuit institutions became waypoints along hidden corridors, creating routes that allowed scientists, engineers, and their families to quietly transition from Europe to the Americas. In the shadow of cathedrals and cloisters, the machinery of movement operated with a near imperceptible precision. Jesuit involvement, whether intentional or incidental, became evident through education and influence. Many of the scientists had been exposed to Jesuit schools or European institutions where Jesuit philosophy informed both curriculum and ethos. The order's emphasis on discipline, critical thinking, and the careful evaluation of consequences equipped these individuals not only to survive, but to excel once relocated. Jesuits did not wield a literal hand in recruiting these figures, but the intellectual foundation and moral frameworks instilled in countless European classrooms indirectly shaped the minds who would become assets in Operation Paperclip. The Vatican's involvement was not merely about facilitating physical movement. It extended to legitimacy, documentation, and moral justification. In some accounts, clergy provided travel papers, certificates of humanitarian protection, and guidance on navigating a post-war Europe dominated by suspicion and bureaucratic chaos. This blending of faith, strategy, and practicality is characteristic of the Jesuit approach across centuries: influence without fanfare, power without visibility, and guidance without open acknowledgement. Operation Paperclip highlights a paradox. Those who once served tyranny were repurposed to serve freedom, or at least the emerging geopolitical order defined by the Cold War. And Jesuits, long habituated to navigating complex moral terrains, were uniquely positioned to reconcile these tensions. Their centuries of experience balancing faith, obedience, and worldly influence allowed them to operate quietly, understanding that strategic outcomes often required discretion over confrontation and subtle guidance over public pronouncement. Yet while history remembers generals, presidents, and engineers, it rarely highlights the quiet architecture that made such operations possible. Popular culture, through films and documentaries, often dramatizes the narrative with espionage, suspense, and larger-than-life characters. In doing so, it obscures the subtler truth that institutions like the Jesuits, operating behind the scenes for centuries, had already shaped the minds, philosophies, and behaviors of those who would come to define post-war power. The narrative of spies, agents, and rockets distracts from the quieter forces of education, moral framing, and influence that truly steer outcomes over decades. By facilitating escape routes, advising indirectly through intellectual preparation, and embedding a philosophy of strategy and discernment in their institutions, Jesuits contributed to a process that extended far beyond the immediate logistics of Paperclip. They demonstrated once again that influence does not always roar. It whispers in classrooms, shapes decisions behind closed doors, and informs the trajectories of men who will never acknowledge their silent teachers. Operation Paperclip thus becomes more than a tale of post-war pragmatism. It is a testament to how invisible networks, nurtured by centuries of careful observation and strategic education, can mold the course of nations. In the quiet halls of the Vatican, among documents, corridors, and the subtle council of religious orders, the echoes of influence continued, unseen by the world, yet instrumental in shaping the dawn of the atomic and aerospace age. In the midst of war, where the world sees rubble, blood, and despair, a quieter presence often goes unnoticed. Jesuit priests and brothers, draped not in camouflage but in black robes, have silently carved a space where faith, humanitarianism, and strategic observation converge. From the besieged streets of Aleppo to the dense jungles of the Congo, Jesuits have maintained a presence long after most governments, NGOs, and foreign journalists have withdrawn. Their mission is layered: to provide aid, to comfort, and perhaps more quietly, to observe and understand the forces shaping societies in turmoil. The Jesuit philosophy has always recognized the profound connection between knowledge and influence. In war zones, this principle finds its most practical application. Schools are opened in refugee camps not merely to educate, but to instill critical thinking, moral discernment, and a sense of structured ethics in young minds scarred by violence. Medical aid is provided not just to save bodies, but to understand the shifting networks of power, allegiance, and survival that govern these fractured communities. Each action, every classroom, every clinic, becomes a lens through which Jesuits observe, quietly mapping the social and political terrain. Their role in conflict zones is paradoxical. They do not carry weapons. They do not issue commands. Yet their influence is tangible. By becoming a trusted presence, Jesuits gain access to information unavailable to governments or intelligence agencies. Families confide in them, local leaders consult them, and soldiers, both conscripts and rebels, respect their counsel. In areas where ideology clashes violently and loyalties are fragile, the Jesuit presence often acts as a stabilizing force, subtly shaping outcomes that ripple far beyond the immediate crisis. Consider Syria, where cities like Aleppo and Homs were reduced to rubble. Jesuit organizations, sometimes operating in coordination with local churches, provided not only food and medical assistance, but also channels of communication between warring factions. In the Congo, amid ethnic conflicts and civil unrest, Jesuit missionaries facilitated dialogues between rival groups, promoting reconciliation while observing the undercurrents of influence that might determine the future of governance. Their approach is methodical, patient, and deeply informed by centuries of understanding human behavior in complex systems. Yet this is not humanitarian work alone. Jesuits operate with a profound awareness of the world beyond the immediate theater of conflict. Reports from the field, insights into local cultures, and observations of emerging leaders often reach academic and ecclesiastical centers. These insights, though cloaked in discretion, inform global strategies, shaping policies on migration, conflict resolution, and social development. In a world increasingly dependent on data and intelligence, the Jesuit model blends moral authority with strategic observation in a way few secular organizations can match. The genius of the Jesuit presence in modern conflict zones lies in subtlety. Power is rarely flaunted. Influence is cultivated slowly, quietly, and persistently. In classrooms, they mold critical minds. In clinics, they observe patterns of human resilience and breakdown. In refugee camps, they sow the seeds of leadership and ethical reasoning. Decades later, those seeds may blossom into leaders, thinkers, or agents of change who shape societies, often without realizing who quietly guided their development. Jesuits demonstrate that influence in modern conflicts is not always kinetic. It is intellectual, ethical, and deeply embedded. The world may focus on armies, treaties, and headlines, but the quiet architecture of change is often crafted by those who remain unseen. In the heart of the world's most dangerous landscapes, Jesuits endure, teaching, observing, guiding, and quietly shaping the moral and strategic contours of our time. And in this silence, they wield a power more enduring than any weapon, the power to shape the minds and hearts of those who will rebuild the world from its ashes. In a world shaped by ideologies, revolutions, and shifting moral landscapes, the Jesuits have perfected a subtler form of influence, one that does not rely on armies, laws, or coercion, but on the cultivation of ideas and values over decades. They are, in many ways, spiritual engineers, architects of belief, education, and social consciousness. From the streets of Buenos Aires to the villages of Africa, Jesuit priests quietly embed themselves in communities, guiding the hearts and minds of those who will ultimately shape the future. The essence of their influence lies in patience. They do not seek immediate control. Instead, they cultivate generations of thinkers, leaders and reformers who internalize principles of discernment, justice and critical thought. In South America, for instance, Jesuit educators played a pivotal role in nurturing the ideas behind liberation theology, a movement intertwining Catholic faith with social justice. Priests, theologians and students worked in tandem, examining the structures of power that oppressed the poor, questioning established hierarchies, and exploring how faith could be an instrument of ethical and political change. Yet the Jesuits themselves often remained in the background, guiding without overt leadership, allowing movements to appear organic, born of the people rather than the order. This model extends far beyond theology. Jesuits are educators, social organizers, and advisors. They operate in academic institutions, political think tanks, and community programs. In each space, they teach more than subjects. They impart frameworks for understanding society, ethics, and decision-making. A student who graduates from a Jesuit university carries with them not only knowledge, but a lens, an analytical, moral, and strategic perspective that subtly shapes their approach to leadership. Over decades, this becomes a ripple effect. One classroom influencing a local council, one research center shaping policy, one activist network sowing ideas that bloom into national or even regional reforms. Their role in activism and social reform is particularly nuanced. Jesuits have been present in some of the most ideologically charged periods of modern history. During the struggles for land reform, racial equality, and indigenous rights, Jesuit priests often acted as intermediaries, mediators, and moral guides. They were not simply advocates, they were facilitators of thought, helping communities envision alternatives while maintaining a disciplined, strategic perspective. Their guidance shaped movements in ways that few observers could detect, balancing moral instruction with practical action, influence without overt authority. What makes Jesuit influence remarkable is its durability. Unlike political operatives or revolutionary leaders, their power is not tied to tenure, elections, or public recognition. A priest in a small parish may never be known outside his town, yet through decades of mentorship, teaching, and counsel, his impact can extend across continents. Every lecture, every sermon, every conversation becomes part of a subtle architecture of influence, reinforcing values, guiding judgment, and shaping the decisions of future leaders. Even in the contemporary world, where global media amplifies voices and technology accelerates change, Jesuits continue their work with discretion. Social platforms, humanitarian organizations, and global academic institutions become conduits for their philosophy, ensuring that influence is both pervasive and invisible. In this sense, they are engineers not of buildings or machines, but of society itself, quietly calibrating the moral compass, intellectual capacity, and strategic vision of generations. In essence, the Jesuits demonstrate that power does not always announce itself with pomp or violence. Sometimes it manifests in classrooms, in libraries, in local communities where ideas are planted, nurtured, and allowed to grow. By shaping minds over generations, they guide societies not through imposition, but through understanding, reflection, and subtle persuasion. In a world defined by overt conflict and visible authority, their mastery lies in invisibility. They engineer faith, ethics, and intellect, and in doing so quietly construct the blueprint of nations, movements, and the future itself. In the shadows of towering banks and corporate boardrooms, influence often moves in whispers, transactions, and carefully calculated decisions. Few realize that for nearly 5 centuries, the Jesuits have not only preached faith, but also mastered the subtle currents of finance. Their wealth is not measured merely in gold or property, but in networks of trust, enduring relationships with elite families, and a presence in global economic projects that quietly shape markets, policy, and opportunity. From the corridors of Renaissance Europe to modern megacities, Jesuits have cultivated relationships with influential dynasties, philanthropists, and entrepreneurs. These are not the ostentatious alliances of public spectacle, but carefully maintained ties rooted in shared intellectual, religious, and social values. Monasteries and universities, far from being isolated centers of faith, became nodes in a vast lattice of knowledge and capital. Donations, endowments, and investments flowed into Jesuit institutions, fueling schools, research centers, and missions, while simultaneously providing leverage in spheres of influence that extended far beyond spiritual guidance. In Latin America, Europe, and Asia, Jesuit-run universities and financial institutions became incubators for leaders, both secular and religious, who would later command governments, corporations, and think tanks. Students trained under Jesuit tutelage absorbed more than doctrine. They learned discipline, ethical judgment, and strategic thinking. Many of these alumni, once in positions of power, maintained connections with their alma mater, ensuring that Jesuit influence flowed quietly through policy decisions, economic reform, and social development initiatives. Wealth in this context was not simply currency. It was a vehicle for shaping society over decades, a lever to align moral, educational, and political objectives with long-term visions. The order's financial acumen was particularly evident in periods of upheaval. Wars, revolutions, and economic crises did not destabilize Jesuit networks as they did others. Their approach combined prudence with foresight. Investments diversified across continents, philanthropic ventures tied to educational and social initiatives, and discreet partnerships with influential families and corporations. In each case, the Jesuits ensured that capital remained a tool of stability, influence, and ideological continuity. Beyond conventional finance, Jesuits have also impacted global development projects. Infrastructure initiatives, humanitarian missions, and international aid programs often intersect with Jesuit guidance, blending economic planning with moral and social objectives. Here, influence is subtle but pervasive. Funds allocated for education, healthcare, or environmental projects are shaped by ethical frameworks instilled by the order, ensuring that outcomes align with broader visions of justice, stewardship, and social cohesion. In essence, money becomes a language through which ideas are implemented, networks strengthened, and societies quietly guided. Yet their power is rarely acknowledged publicly. Mainstream narratives seldom highlight the role of religious orders in economic development, intellectual finance, or policy influence. The Jesuit strategy thrives precisely because it is understated. They do not seek headlines or the glare of media scrutiny. Instead, they cultivate patience, strategy, and relationships that endure across generations. A grant here, an advisory role there. Small interventions that, over decades, ripple outward, shaping leadership, institutions, and nations. Even in the contemporary era of global finance, where multinational corporations and international organizations dominate, Jesuit networks remain quietly influential. Alumni in exec, UTIV suites, advisory boards, and policy circles carry with them the philosophy and discipline instilled in Jesuit classrooms. These connections, fortified over centuries, allow the order to remain a consistent, stabilizing force, a subtle architect of economic and social currents worldwide. Ultimately, the Jesuits demonstrate that influence is rarely about overt control. True power often flows quietly, through intellect, relationships, and stewardship. By intertwining finance, education, and ethical guidance, they wield a force that shapes both the material and moral landscapes of our world. In boardrooms, universities, and international forums, the fingerprints of the Jesuits are present, silent, calculated, and enduring, an invisible architecture guiding the course of global society. In the quiet halls of Jesuit classrooms, lessons unfold that ripple far beyond textbooks and lectures. Here, education is not merely a transfer of knowledge. It is the cultivation of minds trained to see the world as a system, to understand patterns, and to navigate complexities with clarity and foresight. From the ornate courtyards of European colleges to modern campuses in Asia and the Americas, Jesuit schools and universities have long operated as laboratories of influence, shaping the thinkers, leaders, and strategists of tomorrow. Unlike conventional education, Jesuit pedagogy blends rigorous intellectual discipline with moral and ethical reasoning. Students are taught to weigh decisions not only by immediate outcomes, but by long-term consequences, to consider societal impact alongside personal ambition. Logic, rhetoric, philosophy, and theology are interwoven with lessons in leadership, diplomacy, and problem-solving. The result is an education that cultivates not only knowledge, but perspective, a capacity to analyze situations, anticipate moves, and respond with strategic precision. For centuries, this approach has quietly produced leaders who later rise to positions of power across government, business, and academia. Military officers, heads of state, corporate executives, and diplomats often carry within them the intellectual scaffolding built in Jesuit classrooms. Their strategic thinking, ethical reasoning, and ability to navigate complex human networks are legacies of an educational system designed to extend influence far beyond the walls of the school. Each lesson, debate, or moral dilemma serves as a microcosm of the broader world, preparing students to operate effectively in global arenas where every decision has cascading consequences. The Jesuit approach to education emphasizes discernment, the art of choosing wisely, guided by ethical principles and informed understanding. Students are encouraged to analyze history not just for dates and events, but for patterns of power, for the ways societies rise and fall, for the underlying forces that shape human behavior. This mindset fosters leaders who can operate in subtlety, understanding that influence is often more effective when it flows invisibly, rather than imposed openly. Diplomacy, negotiation, and strategic patience become natural skills, cultivated alongside classical studies and spiritual formation. Beyond individual development, Jesuit institutions serve as nodes of a broader network. Alumni remain connected across continents, providing channels for collaboration, coordination, and influence. When crises arise, be they political upheavals, economic shifts, or humanitarian disasters, this network can mobilize insight, guidance, and leadership quietly and efficiently. Through these educational pipelines, the Society of Jesus extends its reach without visibility, shaping the architects of policy, governance, and cultural change before they even step into public life. In the modern era, where international relations are a delicate interplay of power, perception, and persuasion, such strategic education is invaluable. Jesuit-trained leaders are adept at understanding both overt and covert dynamics, interpreting signals, and anticipating outcomes. They learn to balance principle with pragmatism, morality with influence, and idealism with operational effectiveness. It is an education designed not merely to teach, but to mold the very framework through which the world's decisions are understood and made. And yet the power of this system is subtle. The order does not seek to dominate through force or overt control. It operates through the cultivation of insight, wisdom, and the disciplined exercise of influence. The classrooms, lecture halls, and seminar rooms are the quiet arenas where future leaders are prepared to engage with the world, carrying forward the Jesuit philosophy into every sphere they enter. In essence, education becomes strategy itself, a tool for shaping minds, societies, and ultimately the arc of history. By embedding principles of critical thought, ethical discernment, and strategic awareness, Jesuits ensure that those who walk their halls are equipped to act thoughtfully, decisively, and with a perspective shaped not only by knowledge, but by an understanding of how the world truly operates. And in that silent, disciplined cultivation, the reach of the order extends, not through force, but through the minds of those who will one day hold the levers of global influence. In the labyrinthine corridors of global influence, where policy, diplomacy, and culture intersect, few names are spoken aloud, yet their impact resonates across continents. Arturo Sosa, the 31st Superior General of the Society of Jesus, is one such figure. Known informally as the Black Pope, he does not occupy the public eye with speeches or campaigns, nor does he seek headlines. His power lies in quiet orchestration, in the subtle shaping of ideas, networks, and institutions that ultimately influence the course of nations. Born in Caracas, Venezuela, in 1948, Sosa's path to the apex of the Jesuit order was guided by a life of rigorous study, political awareness, and spiritual discernment. Fluent in multiple languages and trained in philosophy, political science, and theology, he embodies a rare combination of intellect and strategic foresight. Unlike traditional leaders who rely on overt authority, Sosa operates through mentorship, advisory networks, and the subtle propagation of Jesuit principles across global systems. His influence is less a public performance than a quiet redirection of trajectories, shaping the minds of those who, in turn, shape the world. Across 112 countries, the Jesuits under his leadership manage schools, universities, research centers, and humanitarian organizations. Each institution is more than a center of learning or relief. It is a node in a carefully cultivated network of intellectual, moral, and social influence. Through education, Jesuit teachings embed ethical reasoning, critical thought, and strategic awareness into the next generation of leaders. Students do not always realize it, but every debate, every lesson in leadership, every exercise in discernment carries the imprint of Sosa's overarching philosophy, a belief that change begins in the mind before it manifests in the world. In governance, Jesuit-trained individuals populate advisory councils, think tanks, and even the offices of ministers and policymakers. Through mentorship and institutional guidance, Sosa's vision indirectly steers decisions on social policy, humanitarian priorities, and economic development. Climate policy, for instance, is influenced not merely through advocacy, but through framing it as a moral imperative, connecting ecological stewardship to justice, ethics, and long-term societal stability. Education reforms, sustainable development projects, and even responses to migration crises often carry a subtle Jesuit imprint, reflecting values cultivated under his oversight. Yet influence is never wielded uniformly. Sosa's strategy emphasizes discernment and adaptability. The Jesuits do not dictate, they guide. They work through collaboration and observation, allowing local actors, governments, and communities to enact policies while providing the frameworks, ethical grounding, and knowledge to ensure decisions align with a vision of global stability and justice. This is influence without visibility, a power that flows quietly, persistently across borders. Even in media and culture, the order's reach is subtle. Jesuit scholars contribute to public discourse, shape curricula, and participate in international forums on ethics, climate, and education. The cumulative effect is a society increasingly shaped by principles first nurtured in Jesuit classrooms and research centers, guided by a vision that balances moral responsibility with practical impact. In essence, Arturo Sosa is a conductor in a global symphony, unseen yet orchestrating harmonies of thought, action, and policy. He embodies the modern face of a centuries-old order, not seeking domination through force or decree, but cultivating a network of knowledge, ethics, and strategic insight that quietly reshapes the world. From the streets of Caracas to the halls of the United Nations, from remote humanitarian missions to elite academic institutions, the Black Pope's influence is everywhere. Felt but rarely seen, guiding decisions, shaping values, and quietly drawing the map of the 21st century. The power of Arturo Sosa is not measured in titles or visibility. It is measured in the ideas he nurtures, the leaders he trains, and the subtle, enduring currents of influence flowing from Jesuit institutions into every corner of modern society. In a world of overt authority and public spectacle, he remains a reminder that the most profound power is often invisible, exercised not with force, but through the patient, quiet shaping of minds, values, and vision. In the 21st century, the role of religion has shifted. Gone are the grand displays of political theocracy or the armies of crusading popes. Yet faith has not disappeared from the halls of influence. It has adapted, refined, and found new channels to shape the world. At the center of this subtle transformation are the Jesuits, an order that for centuries has combined spiritual devotion with education, strategy, and societal insight. While governments enact policy and corporations wield financial might, the Jesuits work quietly, cultivating ethical frameworks, intellectual rigor, and strategic thinking in the minds of tomorrow's leaders. Jesuit institutions, from classrooms in remote villages to prestigious universities in metropolitan capitals, are more than centers of knowledge. They are incubators of thought, moral reasoning, and societal vision. Students are taught to weigh consequences, discern values, and think systematically about complex problems. These are not mere lessons in theology. They are teachings in leadership, ethics, and strategy. A young politician, diplomat, or executive shaped by Jesuit education carries more than academic knowledge. They carry a lens through which they view the world, a framework that quietly guides decisions decades later. This influence extends far beyond the classroom. Jesuits engage in conferences, policy forums, and advisory roles that intersect with government, international organizations, and global NGOs. In each context, their presence is subtle but profound. They do not dictate policy, nor do they seek headlines. Rather, they frame conversations, highlight ethical considerations, and provide historical and philosophical context that guides decision-making. In climate negotiations, social justice initiatives, or humanitarian crises, Jesuit-trained advisors can often be found steering discussion toward long-term sustainability, human dignity, and systemic solutions. One of the hallmarks of this new political religion is its adaptability. Unlike earlier centuries, when faith was often imposed, today it operates through values, ideas, and persuasion. Jesuits have mastered the art of embedding ethical principles within secular institutions. A CEO, educated in a Jesuit school, may champion fair labor practices. A young legislator may design policies that balance economic growth with social responsibility. Each action, seemingly independent, reflects the subtle architecture of Jesuit thought, strategic, ethical, and quietly pervasive. The influence is generational. Today's students, immersed in Jesuit pedagogy, may one day hold power in governments, corporations, and international organizations. They carry forward principles that the order has honed for centuries: discernment, ethical responsibility, and the capacity to shape outcomes without relying on force. In this sense, political religion is not about imposing belief. It is about shaping mindsets, embedding values, and influencing decisions that ripple through society for decades. Yet there is an inherent tension. The power of ideas can be transformative or manipulative, depending on who wields them. Jesuits have historically recognized this duality. They teach students to think critically, to act ethically, and to consider the consequences of power. And while some leaders may use these tools for service, others may pursue authority. In either case, the philosophy instilled in their formative years leaves a lasting imprint, making the order's influence both subtle and enduring. In the modern world, where authority is diffuse, information flows instantly, and values are contested, the Jesuits' quiet strategy proves remarkably effective. They do not command with armies, they lead with intellect. They do not legislate, they teach discernment. They do not dominate with wealth, they cultivate the ethical frameworks that guide wealth and power toward, or sometimes away from, human flourishing. Political religion in the 21st century is less about spectacle and more about substance. It is not written on banners or etched in law. It is embedded in minds, decisions, and social norms. And at the center of this quiet revolution stands an order that has spent nearly 5 centuries perfecting the art of shaping human destiny without ever being seen. In classrooms, in conferences, in the lives of those touched by Jesuit thought, faith has returned, not as a forceful hand, but as a guiding principle, subtly steering the course of a complex, interconnected world. History is often taught as a collection of dates, names, and events, a linear progression from one moment to the next. Textbooks offer a neat narrative, a curated version of the past that is easy to digest. Yet behind these pages lies a deeper, quieter story, one rarely told. The influence of the Jesuits is one such hidden thread, woven subtly into the tapestry of global history, shaping the minds of rulers, scholars, and revolutionaries, while remaining largely invisible to the public eye. For nearly 5 centuries, the Society of Jesus has operated at the intersection of faith, education, and strategy. Their goal was never merely to teach doctrine, it was to cultivate intellect, discipline, and critical thinking in ways that could influence society across generations. From European universities to colonial missions in the Americas, Asia, and Africa, Jesuits constructed a network of learning that combined moral philosophy with practical strategy. Yet these contributions are seldom acknowledged in standard curricula. Galileo's protection by Jesuit scholars, the subtle shaping of political minds in South America, and the cultivation of ethical and analytical reasoning in future leaders are rarely mentioned in classrooms, hidden behind the official story of history. This omission is not an accident. The Jesuits understood the power of narrative, recognizing that control over knowledge shapes perception, and perception shapes action. History taught in a vacuum, devoid of context about who influenced the thinkers, advisors, and rulers of each era, renders invisible the subtle architectures of power. A general may march into battle believing he acts independently, yet his strategies may have been shaped by Jesuit tutors in rhetoric and logic decades earlier. A president may sign reforms, unaware that foundational lessons in ethics, diplomacy, and philosophy were cultivated under the guidance of Jesuit mentors. In this way, the curriculum is not just what is taught, but what is left untaught. The hidden curriculum extends beyond politics and governance. Science, philosophy, literature, and the arts have all been touched by Jesuit influence. Mathematicians and astronomers trained in Jesuit observatories, from Europe to the Americas, contributed discoveries that shaped modern thought. Philosophers steeped in Jesuit debate learned not only to think critically, but to weigh ethical and social consequences. Artists educated in Jesuit schools were guided not only in technique, but in the subtle power of symbolism and narrative. Across disciplines, the order cultivated minds capable of shaping societies in ways both overt and unseen. Yet the paradox remains. Jesuits preach humility, service, and faith, while simultaneously wielding profound influence. Their power is not displayed through crowns or armies, but through the careful shaping of thought across generations. The textbooks that claim to summarize history often obscure this reality, offering only fragments of the full picture. The decisions of nations, the revolutions of societies, and the philosophies of entire generations have, at times, been quietly guided by an order whose presence is rarely acknowledged in formal education. Understanding this hidden curriculum forces us to reconsider what we believe we know about the past. History is not simply a chronicle of events, it is the product of influence, guidance, and strategic teaching. The Jesuits' success lies in their ability to educate without boasting, to shape without seizing, and to remain invisible while their impact spreads far and wide. They embody the paradox of religion as both moral guide and instrument of subtle power, a duality that challenges our conventional understanding of knowledge, authority, and historical truth. And so, as students turn the pages of history textbooks, they may never see the full contours of influence that shape the world they inherit. The greatest lessons, it seems, are not always those written in ink, but those left quietly between the lines, a testament to centuries of unseen guidance. The hidden curriculum of history teaches one enduring truth. Power is most effective when it is subtle, patient, and unobserved. The world watches presidents give speeches, CEOs unveil strategies, and religious leaders offer guidance. We measure power by visibility, assuming the person in the spotlight holds authority. Yet history, when examined closely, tells a different story. True influence often moves silently, imperceptibly, like an unseen tide shaping the course of rivers and oceans. The Jesuits, with their centuries-old tradition of education, discipline, and strategic foresight, exemplify this hidden current of power, quietly guiding the trajectory of nations, ideas, and culture. From their founding in 1540, the Society of Jesus cultivated a philosophy that blended moral guidance with practical intelligence. They trained minds, not armies. They taught discernment, not command. Over time, their students, some destined for thrones, others for revolutionary leadership, academic influence, or corporate authority, carried forward the subtle teachings of the order. By shaping the way leaders think, they ensured that decisions across politics, economics, and religion could be influenced without a single public declaration of control. Power, in its most enduring form, is not imposed, it is internalized. Consider the election of Pope Francis, the first Jesuit pope. To the world, it seemed a moment of religious progression. Yet beneath the ceremonial white robes and public appearances lies a continuum of influence that stretches centuries back. Jesuit education, networks of advisors, and philosophical frameworks have quietly guided the Vatican's policies, social stances, and global engagement. The visible pontiff may speak, but the order has long shaped the questions asked, the priorities emphasized, and the responses cultivated. In classrooms, monasteries, and universities across continents, seeds of thought are planted, nurtured, and released into the world through those trained to act ethically, and strategically. The Jesuits' reach extends far beyond the Vatican. Across continents, from war-torn regions to flourishing metropolises, they remain present, teaching, advising, and observing. In conflict zones, humanitarian missions often serve as both aid and insight, allowing the order to understand societies at their most vulnerable. In universities, students are taught to think critically, ethically, and globally. In elite circles, former Jesuit-educated minds influence governments, corporate empires, and cultural institutions. The system is subtle, yet it is vast. Influence is cumulative, invisible, and enduring, often felt only in hindsight. Yet this silent power does not command through fear or coercion. It moves through ideas, moral philosophy, and education. It bends the course of history not through brute force, but by shaping the frameworks through which decisions are made. In this way, the Jesuits exemplify a timeless truth. Authority is most effective when it is unseen. The world may debate leaders, dynasties, and movements, but the quiet architects often remain beyond scrutiny, guiding outcomes without ever appearing in headlines. As we reflect on modern crises, climate change, social upheaval, geopolitical tension, the question emerges again: who truly shapes our future? It is rarely the figure who speaks, waves, or issues directives. It is the unseen network, the long-term vision, the cultivated philosophy that quietly steers societies. For nearly 5 centuries, the Jesuits have demonstrated that enduring power lies not in visibility, but in influence that endures across generations, shaping thought, culture, and action with patience and precision. History, in the end, is not written by those in front of the cameras. It is guided by those who understand minds, values, and the long arc of society. The Jesuits, through education, philosophy, and silent networks, exemplify this hidden hand. They remind us that true authority is subtle, persistent, and often invisible, and that the most profound question of all is not who rules today, but who has shaped the very minds of those who do. In the quiet corridors of power, in classrooms, monasteries, and seminaries, in conversations never recorded, the Jesuits continue their work. The world may never fully see it, and yet the consequences ripple outward, shaping history itself. The visible leaders may occupy the stage, but the order has long ensured that the script is thoughtfully, strategically, and quietly guided. And perhaps, in understanding this hidden influence, we come closer to answering a question as old as power itself. Who truly rules the world? As the shadows of history slowly fade, we are left with questions more than answers. The Jesuits, the silent architects behind centuries of education, power, and strategy, continue to influence a world that rarely notices their presence. From hidden classrooms to Vatican corridors, from revolutionaries to presidents, their philosophy, discipline, and vision quietly shape destinies. The stories we uncovered today remind us that power is not always loud, nor is influence always visible. It is subtle, patient, and persistent, woven into the minds of leaders, the hearts of societies, and the structures of history itself. If this journey into the unseen forces that guide our world moved you, like this video to honor the invisible hands that have shaped humanity, share it to invite others into these hidden truths, and subscribe to Mysteries of Earth. Every click is a commitment to continue exploring the mysteries history never taught us.